I have lived through many strange moments in my life, but nothing compares to the night that still haunts me from a long road trip. A few months ago, my friend Serena and I set out from Atlanta, Georgia, bound for Cleveland, Ohio. We had spent a few days with old college friends, and were eager to return to our routines with a sense of adventure still fresh in our hearts. The plan was simple: a long drive filled with good music, snacks, and the comfortable chatter that only longtime friends share. Yet, as the miles slipped by under the quiet hum of the engine, an unsettling feeling began to take root. After driving through the early hours of the morning, fatigue caught up with me. My back ached from sitting in the same position for so long, and I suggested we pull over for a break. We found ourselves exiting onto a narrow road that led to a small town boasting itself as a lively tourist destination. Its faded billboards promised unique shops and local history, but as soon as our car slowed to a stop, I sensed that something was off. The streets were eerily empty, and the once vibrant buildings now looked worn and neglected, as if they were relics of a past that had long since vanished. Our first stop was a modest convenience store on the outskirts of the town. The interior was dimly lit, but appeared normal at first glance. I remember the cashier, a tall woman in her early 30s with dark brown hair and an unusual pair of suspenders that caught my eye. I purchased a cold drink, and for a moment, the mundane ritual of paying and leaving provided a comforting distraction from the strangeness outside. Not long after, Serena pointed out another convenience store just across the street, and we decided to try our luck there. As I walked up to the counter with my beverage in hand, I froze. Behind the register stood a woman who looked exactly like the cashier from the first store. Same dark hair, same tall stature, the same suspenders. My heart pounded as I stared in disbelief, and I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. I asked her silently, through my racing thoughts, if she had a twin or perhaps a sister. The woman's expression turned guarded and almost skeptical, and she offered no explanation beyond a curt dismissal of my unspoken question. I could feel Serena's confusion as I backed away from the counter, the image of that identical face burning in my memory. Determined to prove that I wasn't simply exhausted and imagining things, Serena and I hurried back to the first store. But when we arrived, the cashier there was no longer the familiar figure we had seen earlier. Instead, a completely different woman, a shorter, lighter-haired, middle-aged lady, was tending the counter. The inexplicable change left me shaken to my core, and Serena tried to reassure me that perhaps I was just too tired from our long drive. Still, I knew what I had seen, and the feeling of unreality only deepened. We left the strange town with an uneasy heaviness in our hearts, and decided to refuel before resuming our journey. Our next stop was at a gas station that, at first, seemed deserted. The lot was empty except for our car and a solitary building at the rear where payments were made. We stepped inside briefly, but as soon as we emerged, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. In less than a couple of minutes, the gas station had transformed into a crowded, bustling scene. Cars began lining up at every pump, and throngs of people filled the parking area, their eyes fixated on us in a way that felt both invasive and inexplicable. My skin crawled as I sensed that something was terribly amiss. The sudden change, from barren solitude to an overwhelming crowd, left me disoriented, and I could see Serena sharing the same look of silent alarm. We quickly gathered our things and returned to the car, eager to leave that oppressive scene behind. Yet the haunting events were not done with us. Back on the highway, a new and bizarre phenomenon began to unfold. As I drove, a Toyota minivan appeared in our rearview mirror, its windshield marred by a sprawling spiderweb crack, and its sides scratched as if it had been in a collision. I was startled by its unmistakable appearance. Just as I thought it was a one-time occurrence, the same minivan reappeared a few minutes later, its damaged form eerily identical to the first sighting. It was impossible to dismiss. Two separate encounters with a vehicle so distinct could not be mere coincidence. My pulse raced as I glanced at the GPS. To my shock, it registered that nearly an hour had passed since we had left the gas station, a discrepancy that defied logic. I fought the rising panic inside me, struggling to keep control of the steering wheel and my own thoughts. Serena urged me to speed up, to put as much distance as possible between us and that unsettling stretch of road. I complied, my hands trembling as I accelerated, determined to outrun the eerie occurrences that seemed intent on trapping us in a nightmarish loop. The rest of the drive was shrouded in a heavy silence. Every passing mile offered a fragile hope that we were leaving the bizarre world behind. Yet the memory of that haunted town, the ghostly convenience stores, and the inexplicable reappearance of that minivan lingered like a dark shadow. By the time we finally arrived at our destination, hours later than planned, I felt as though I was waking from a surreal, disjointed dream. Even now, when I recount that night, I am met with skeptical looks from those who have never experienced such inexplicable events. I have spent countless hours searching online for similar stories, and while I have found a few accounts that mirror my own, nothing can truly explain the gut-wrenching feeling of dread I experienced. It was as if every bone in my body screamed that something was profoundly wrong, a warning I have never forgotten. That road trip left me with a lingering unease, a reminder that sometimes the boundaries between reality and the unknown blur in ways we cannot comprehend. I have learned to listen to that inner voice that warns me when something is off, and I pray that I never feel that unshakable, haunting vibe again. Story number 2. I have always been tied to that battered 2012 sedan, a clunker my family reluctantly held on to despite its endless list of problems. The car's brakes felt soft and unresponsive, its engine sputtered unpredictably, and almost every electronic system seemed on the brink of failure. Yet, through all its flaws, it kept moving, a stubborn relic that I was forced to drive. My parents had long dreamed of a replacement, but until that day came, the keys were mine. Not long ago, I had taken a road trip to visit my old friend Marcus in southern Arizona. The weekend had been filled with laughter, long conversations under clear skies, and the kind of carefree moments that make you forget about life's complications. With the weekend behind me, I set off on the journey back home, relishing the solitude of the open road and the shifting landscapes that unfolded outside my windshield. The drive was smooth at first. Rolling hills and sparse desert towns gave way to an endless sea of rugged land as I crossed the state line into Nevada. Then, as if on cue, the weather turned abruptly. A violent thunderstorm erupted, transforming the desert into a chaotic, unforgiving world of torrential rain and jagged flashes of lightning. My car's nearly defunct windshield wipers could do little to cut through the downpour. The rain blurred everything into a haze of gray and white. Realizing that I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, I reluctantly pulled off the highway. I parked on the shoulder far from the road, a solitary figure stranded in the vast, barren Nevada desert. The landscape was an endless expanse of craggy rocks and arid earth, with only the howling wind and relentless rain for company. Inside the car, the sound of the storm was deafening. A constant drum of rain mingled with the deep rumble of distant thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. I sat there, huddled in the driver's seat, feeling the weight of isolation settle over me. The storm raged on without mercy, and as darkness crept in, the open desert around me transformed into an arena of looming shadows and unsettling stillness. Every flash of lightning briefly illuminated the desolation, only to vanish into oppressive blackness moments later. After what felt like an eternity, my eyes caught sight of something entirely unexpected. Amid the violent flashes of the storm, I began to notice a series of sharp, bright bursts of white light. They were not the jagged bolts of lightning I'd grown accustomed to. They moved deliberately, almost methodically, and were growing steadily closer. My heart began to race as I tried to comprehend what I was witnessing. Before I could process my thoughts, 3 figures emerged from the dark horizon. Each carried a flashlight, their beams cutting erratically through the torrential rain. The light from those flashlights danced across the ground in a jittery, desperate pattern, as though the figures were searching for something, or perhaps someone. Their movements were not natural. There was an odd, almost frantic quality to them that sent chills down my spine. Then, in a moment that nearly paralyzed me with fear, one of the figures raised a small firearm and fired a single shot into the night sky. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed across the empty desert, making my heart pound so fiercely I could hardly breathe. Panic surged through me. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone, barely managing to dial emergency services as my mind raced with unanswerable questions. In sheer terror, I abandoned the safety of my car and scrambled behind a large rock formation. My entire body was tense, every muscle coiled as I pressed myself low to the ground. I kept my eyes fixed on the flashlights as they swept around the area where my car sat, inspecting it, as if searching for a sign of life. The rhythmic thumping of the rain on the desert floor and the distant echoing sounds of the storm provided a grim soundtrack to my racing thoughts. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I waited in that exposed, vulnerable position. The figures continued their erratic movements for several long minutes, their beams of light darting across the cracked earth. I could feel the wet chill of fear seep into my bones. Every instinct urged me to remain motionless, to be nothing more than a shadow blending into the dark backdrop of the desert. Eventually, as if by some strange collective decision, the figures receded into the darkness. Their flashlights flickered one final time before vanishing completely, leaving me alone once again with only the relentless roar of the storm. I remained hidden behind the rock for what felt like an eternity, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Finally, with shaking limbs, I crept back to my car and dialed 911. My voice barely a whisper as I recounted the surreal events of that night. The operator's calm assurances did little to dispel the lingering dread as I sat there watching the storm slowly begin to subside. In the distance, the faint blue glow of police lights eventually pierced the darkness. As the officers arrived, their presence lent a temporary sense of security to the otherwise uncanny scene. I explained every detail: the relentless storm, the inexplicable flashlights, the piercing gunshot, and the unsettling behavior of those mysterious figures. The officers listened intently, their expressions serious as they took my statement. They promised to investigate the area, though their measured words did little to ease the lingering uncertainty that gripped me. In the days that followed, the memory of that harrowing night haunted my every thought. The image of the dark desert, the fury of the storm, and those strange, erratic flashes of light played over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come face to face with something beyond the realm of ordinary explanation, a glimpse into a mystery that defied logic and rational thought. Even now, whenever I drive on quiet, open roads, a cold shiver runs down my spine as I recall that night. The relentless thunder, the blinding rain, and the inexplicable presence of those figures have become etched into my memory. I often wonder if I truly encountered something supernatural, or if the isolation and raw power of the desert had simply pushed my mind to the edge of fear and imagination. That night taught me that, in the most desolate corners of our world, reality can warp and reveal secrets too bizarre to ever be fully understood. As I continue my journey through life, the memory of that stormy desert night remains, a chilling reminder that sometimes the boundary between what we know and what lurks in the shadows is perilously thin. Story number 3. When I was in my early 20s, I found myself adrift after ending a 2-year relationship that once defined my world. I lived about 30 minutes outside of Portland, Maine, a quiet stretch of land where every day passed slowly, and life's meaning often seemed just out of reach. I was in a state of wandering, both physically and emotionally, searching for something to steady my soul. During that uncertain time, my Nana Evelyn remained a constant pillar of strength. Ever since my grandfather, a decorated veteran revered by our small community, passed away, her faith had grown even more intense. Every Sunday, without fail, she attended the local church, her steps purposeful, her eyes alight with a deep, unshakable belief. I began to accompany her to these services, partly to support her through her grief, and partly to find a bit of grounding for myself. The old church, with its worn wooden pews and stained glass windows that painted the floor in vibrant hues, offered a sense of peace that I desperately needed. One cool autumn morning, after a particularly moving service, I noticed someone new in the congregation. Standing quietly at the back, a young woman with dark curly hair and deep hazel eyes caught my attention. There was an aura of mystery about her, an almost palpable sadness mingled with quiet determination. I couldn't help but be drawn to her. She seemed like a stranger from another world who had somehow wandered into my familiar routine. In the days that followed, my thoughts kept returning to her. I learned her name was Elena, and that she had recently moved to our area to attend a nearby college. Despite her reserved nature, she sent me a few cautious messages. There was something refreshingly genuine about her. Unlike the vast, impersonal world of social media, her online presence was modest and carefully guarded. Each message made me feel as if I were slowly uncovering a secret, a story written in small, deliberate strokes rather than in broad, boastful lines. One Sunday, Feeling a spark of hope and courage, I invited Elena on a simple outing. We chose a quiet evening, first watching an old movie at a local theater, then sharing a meal at a small diner known for its home-style cooking. The diner, with its soft lighting and the gentle hum of other patrons, became our sanctuary for that night. As I sat there, I felt the gradual unfurling of trust and the promise of a connection that might heal some of the lingering emptiness inside me. After dinner, I suggested we take a drive along a secluded country road, a road that curved gently through a forest of whispering pines and towering oaks. The night was clear and cool. The sky stretched above us, studded with countless stars, and the road was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For a time, everything felt perfect, a moment suspended between the familiar comfort of routine and the thrill of discovering something new. But as we ventured further, the atmosphere shifted in a way I could not have predicted. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the soft rustling of leaves gave way to an unsettling silence. Without warning, I noticed a change in Elena. Her eyes grew distant, and her lips moved in a way that was almost frantic. I couldn't understand the words she was uttering. They came out as a rapid, mumbled stream in a language I did not recognize, filled with a strange urgency that sent shivers down my spine. In that instant, a cold dread washed over me. I watched in horror as her once warm, inviting eyes rolled back, exposing only the stark whiteness of her sclera. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could barely keep my hands steady on the steering wheel. The car veered dangerously close to the roadside barrier, and panic surged through me. In a desperate bid to regain control, I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind reeling with confusion and fear. I fumbled for my phone, my trembling fingers barely managing to dial emergency services as my thoughts raced. I tried to explain the inexplicable, the way Elena's voice had transformed into an eerie chant, the unsettling look in her eyes, and the sudden, uncontrollable sense of dread that gripped me. Every second stretched into an eternity as I sat there, the quiet night suddenly filled with an unbearable tension. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the strange episode ceased. Elena's eyes snapped back to their normal state, and for a fleeting moment, she looked at me with a vacant, almost wild expression that spoke of secrets I would never understand. Before I could even gather my scattered thoughts, she swung open the car door and bolted into the dark, dense woods bordering the road, disappearing into the night like a phantom. I sat there frozen in disbelief, the silence around me shattered only by the pounding of my heart and the whisper of the wind. In that moment, reality felt as if it had slipped away, leaving behind a haunting void filled with unanswered questions. When the emergency responders finally arrived, I recounted every detail, every unnerving moment, every inexplicable shift in Elena's behavior. Their faces revealed concern, but also a quiet skepticism that made my words seem almost unreal. In the days that followed, I returned to the church, hoping desperately for another glimpse of Elena, for some clue to explain the events of that fateful night. But she was gone. Her presence had been erased, as if she had never existed at all. I searched online and asked friends, but all leads faded into silence. Her digital footprint vanished, leaving me alone with the memory of that terrifying encounter. Eventually, I left that small town behind, carrying with me the weight of a mystery that defied all logic. Yet, the memory of that night, of the sudden, inexplicable shift in a gentle soul and her vanishing act into a dark forest remains etched in my mind. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more horror videos. Goodbye.